If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Mark chapter 2. I have some good news and some bad news as it relates to families. First, the bad news. After nearly a decade of research, the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University announced in September of 2011 that nearly half of American families eat only a few times together each week. That 75% of most meals last less than 30 minutes, and that a great deal of our meals take place in front of the television set. The good news is research shows the more meals that families share together with the television set off, the happier and the healthier the children are, the less likely they are to smoke, drink, and use drugs. The study found there is a direct correlation between families having healthy meal times and children having healthy relationships with their parents. In fact, the study revealed that children actually love the family sharing in mealtime together. Mealtime is an important part of almost every culture. At its best, mealtime not only nourishes the human body, but it also nurtures and grows human relationships. In fact, in the New Testament, heaven is oftentimes compared to a banquet. Meals play an important part of Mark's gospel, as we've already seen and we will continue to see as we journey through Mark, including two references in today's text. Even though mostly good things happen when families eat together, you know as well as I do, there are times when Satan uses even mealtime to create chaos within human relationships, and that was the case in today's text, Mark chapter 2, beginning with verse 13. Then Jesus went out to the lake shore again and taught the crowds that were coming to him. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Levi got up and followed him. Later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. And there were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. But when the teachers of religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with such scum?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners." Once when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, some people came to Jesus and they asked, "Why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do?" Jesus replied, "Do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. They can't fast while the groom is with them, but someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Besides, who would patch old clothing with new cloth? For the new patch would shrink and rip away from the old cloth, leaving an even bigger tear than before. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the wine would burst the wineskins, and the wine and the skins would both be lost. New wine calls for new wineskins." So if you take out the outline there on the inside of your bulletin, the first question we see in verses 13 through 17 is this: who does Jesus associate with? Many Bible scholars believe that the Levi Mark talks about here, as well as Luke talks about, is the same individual who wrote another gospel, and in that gospel identified himself as Matthew. Verse 13 tells us that Jesus is teaching along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and he spotted Levi's tax collecting booth. Now, you're probably aware of this, it's widely known, that tax collectors were passionately hated by the Jews. But why? Well, for one, they were employed by the Roman government to collect Roman taxes from their fellow Jews. The Romans had all kinds of taxes. They had a ground tax on which a Jewish farmer paid 10% of his grain and 20% of the fruit that he raised. They had an income tax. They had a poll tax. They collected upon people simply because they were alive. They had a travel tax to use the Roman roads. They had an animal tax. If you walked animals along the Roman road, that cost you even more, and the list goes on. It sounds a lot like today, does it not? A second reason Jewish people hated tax collectors is that in the process of collecting taxes from their fellow Jews for the Roman government, these tax collectors were also skimming money. They were charging extra to line their own pockets, and in doing so were some of the wealthiest Jews. One biblical commentator says that, and I quote, "Tax collectors were universally hated and notoriously dishonest, and as a result, they were forbidden from worshiping in the synagogues. They were considered by the rest of the Jews to be morally unclean." You probably remember the self-righteous Pharisee in Luke chapter 18 and verse 11. And he's praying, and he says, "Lord, I am so thankful that I am not like that tax-collecting scum over there." In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus said, if someone refuses to admit that they have sinned against their brother and they continue to do the same thing over and over again with no remorse, Jesus said, deal with that individual in the same way the Jews treated tax collectors. Now, Jesus was not approving or condoning of the way the Jews treated tax collectors. He was just pointing out how they were to deal with an unrepentant believer. And in our text, not only did Jesus invite one of these hated tax collectors to follow him, to be one of his disciples, but then he went one step further. And he attended a feast that was filled with Levi's tax-collecting friends. And what's more, there were other immoral people there. You see, if nobody was going to associate with the tax collectors, then if they were going to have friends, they'd have to do so amongst themselves and amongst others that the righteous Jews looked down upon. The Jewish people had long forgotten the purpose for which God had called them. When God appeared to Abraham, he made this promise, "I will bless you, and I will make you famous, and I will make you a blessing to others, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you, Abraham." God was saying to Abraham, amongst all the nations of the earth, I will bless the nation that comes from your offspring and from your ancestors. I am giving you and all of those who follow after you a privilege that is unsurpassed in all of human history. But with this tremendous privilege comes a tremendous responsibility. You and your people whom I bless must also be a blessing to others. You must show other nations of people how I deal with those who love me and worship me. That command was later repeated through the prophet Isaiah. God said, I will make you a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. Why were the Jews especially blessed by God above all of the other nations on the earth? Why did God choose that little nation of Israel amongst all of the other nations to bless? Was it so they could thumb their noses at everybody else? Was it so they could say, hey, we are the people of God, tough luck? No. It was so they could take that light of God's love and share it with the rest of the world. Did they do it? No. Matter of fact, they formed their own country club, figuratively speaking, and they said, nobody else belongs to our country club. Nobody else is going to get in. You have to be a Jew. In fact, a little bit later in the book of Acts, when Paul and Barnabas embarked upon their first missionary tour, they took the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Jewish people, and when the Jewish people rejected that message, They then cited this verse in Isaiah 49 and verse 6, and they said, fine, if you will not accept the gospel message, we will now take it, that light, to the Gentile people and share it with them. Jesus had a heart for the hurting. Jesus was drawn to the dejected, the depressed, and the discouraged. Jesus had compassion upon those whom society viewed with contempt. Jesus wanted to be amongst Matthew's friends, even though other Jews of good standing looked down upon them. In fact, these religious snobs, if I can use that term, asked Jesus' disciples, why does he associate with this scum? Doesn't he know any better? Doesn't he realize who he's associating with? And Jesus, overhearing them ask that question, responds, who needs a doctor? Is it that individual who knows that he or she is sick and wants help? Or is it that individual who doesn't think they are sick at all? Now, just because Jesus associated with prostitutes and tax collectors and other immoral people, did that mean he was approving of their lifestyles? Absolutely not. Just because he associated with these kinds of people did not mean that he was accepting of their sin. What it did mean is that Jesus went where the people were. Jesus came to heal people who knew they were sick and wanted help. And the world of the first century and the second century and the third century did not react kindly to the church of the first 3 centuries that reached out and embraced the downtrodden and the sinners of this world. The world looked at the church and said, look at them. Look at who they are reaching out to. And one of the great early Christians, Origen, pointed out that while Jesus reached out and Jesus embraced the heathen of the world, Jesus refused to leave them that way. Regardless of their condition, when they came to Jesus, he transformed them. He made them completely new. And my friends, God blesses the church today that will reach out to those nobody else wants to help. God smiles on that church that will wrap their arms around the unlovely of this world, wash them in the waters of baptism, and then invite them to come and eat with us at the communion table. You remember the fairy tale about the frog that had come under a spell from a wicked witch, and this princess finds the frog and kisses the frog, and he turns back into a prince. You remember that? Someone has said, and I quote, "It is the business of the church of Jesus Christ to kiss frogs." It is a difficult ministry when you reach out to the broken and the beat down and those who have been rejected by the world. Oftentimes they fall back into their sin even after we've invested countless hours in them. They fall back again and again and again. There are many times they will deceive us and they will lie to us. But like the Jewish nation before us, Christ's followers have been called out of the darkness ourselves and into the light so that we might share this light with those who are still living in the dark. We cannot and we dare not build our own Christian country club that only admits those who already think like we do and act like we do. Sometimes the unlovely come and park themselves right here in our midst, and they sit amongst us in worship. They occupy a seat at our coffee table. They smoke outside of our building. And all too many times we get mad or we criticize them. We stay away from us. Shame on us. How are we any different than the Pharisees of Jesus' day when we refuse to share Christ's light with those who need it and those who want it? Jimmy Carter was our nation's 39th president, served from 1977 to 1981. Took his Christian faith seriously. So when Hubert Humphrey, former vice president under Lyndon Johnson, died in January of 1978 during Carter's presidency, there was a large memorial service at the White House. Hundreds of people gathered to honor Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, including the 37th president of the United States, Richard Nixon. Now, for those of us who are old enough to remember, Nixon was forced to resign as the President of the United States amid the Watergate scandal. And the memory of that scandal was still fresh in a lot of people's minds in 1978. And so while people mingled and people greeted their old friends there at Hubert Humphrey's memorial service, former President Nixon stood all alone, isolated, shunned. And when President Carter came in the room and saw former President Nixon standing all alone by himself, Carter walked over with his big smile and surprised everyone by greeting Nixon with these words, "Welcome home, Mr. President. Welcome back home again." When Jesus Christ kissed frogs, they breathed life. They became new people. And Jesus expects you and I to do the same today. We must not confine ourselves to talking only with those we already know, greeting only those we already feel comfortable with, and touching those who are already clean. That's not how Jesus did ministry in the first century. And it is not how Jesus would expect his followers to do ministry in the 21st century. There are those among us who need help. Their lives are messy. Their lives are dirty. And few of them are going to change dramatically overnight. But they want help. And they have surmised that this is the place to get that help. And Jesus has blessed us with grace and love that we do not deserve, so that we might now be a blessing to them. Verses 18 through 22. How does Jesus practice faith? In Shakespeare's play Hamlet, a despondent Prince Hamlet is contemplating whether to live or to take his life when he asks, to be or not to be? That is the question. And the topic being debated in verses 18 through 22 is to eat or not to eat? That is the question. Now, a study of the Old Testament reveals there were many weeks. And if you've read through the Bible with us in the past or are currently doing so, there are many weeks described in the Old Testament when God's people were required to feast. There are great festivals. There's only one day out of the entire calendar year, one day, when they were required to fast. Fasting was the discipline of abstaining from certain foods, or abstaining from eating food, period, or abstaining temporarily from sex, or abstaining from bathing. I mean, the list could go on and on and on. James Packer writes in his book entitled, "Your Father Loves You," and I'm quoting here, "We tend to think of fasting as going without food, but we can fast from anything. If we love music and decide to miss a concert in order to spend time with God, that is fasting. It is helpful to think of the parallel of human friendship. When friends need to be together, they cancel all their other activities in order to make that possible. There's nothing magical about fasting, he says. It's just one way of telling God that your priority at that moment is to be alone with Him, sorting out whatever is necessary, that you have canceled a meal or a party or a concert or whatever else you had planned to do in order to be with Him. Fasting is voluntarily focusing on our relationship with God, seeking His guidance, confessing our sins, and repenting before Him. But the Pharisees had taken this wonderful spiritual discipline and they had turned it into a legalistic means of testing someone's faith. Do they fast like we do? When in reality, fasting is about a person's motives. And only God knows whether our motives are pure or impure. And so our text says, some people came to Jesus with this question: why don't your disciples fast when the disciples of John the Baptist and the Pharisees fast? Now, you know from reading the Gospels that the Pharisees oftentimes came to Jesus with a question, a tough question, because they wanted to stump Him. They wanted to make Him stumble. They wanted Him to say something that wasn't right. They wanted to trap Him in His answer. But I don't think that's what we have here. I think this is a sincere, honest inquiry. Why do your disciples not fast? And the disciples of John the Baptist, they do, and so do the Pharisees. Do you know sometimes that when you get into an argument, sometimes the issue over which somebody is angry about isn't the real issue at all? You know what I'm saying? And likewise, sometimes people ask questions and you say to yourself, there's an issue behind the question. And I think that's what's happening here in our text. The biggest issue here is not fasting. The real question here is this: why doesn't Jesus abide by our rules and abide by the traditions that have been established by our religious rulers? Why doesn't Jesus fall in line with everything that has been established prior to? And honestly, the question could have been over style of music. Why doesn't Jesus like this style of music? The question could have been, who's responsible for shepherding the flock and tending to the flock? The question could have been, who should serve the communion, men or women? I mean, there's all kinds of questions they could have asked Jesus. And Jesus knew that was the case. And so He doesn't just address the issue of fasting, He addresses and challenges their attitudes towards man-made traditions. Now, because fasting is an act of humility, it's not something we normally associate with a wedding. I mean, weddings are full of eating and fun and revelry, and they're festive and dancing. When was the last time you were invited to a wedding fast? Huh? Anybody ever been invited to a wedding fast? Hey, we're having a wedding fast. All right. John the Baptist compared Jesus to a bridegroom at a wedding, and Jesus did the same thing. I understand here the long-awaited Messiah. I mean, the Jewish people have been looking forward to His coming for centuries. He's here. He's arrived. And Jesus is saying, this is not the time for fasting while the bridegroom is here with you. Someday the bridegroom will be gone. Now, you and I can look at that and we know He's talking about His crucifixion. Someday the bridegroom will be gone, and that will be the time to fast. Now, Jesus isn't saying He's not doing away with fasting. In fact, in Matthew in chapter 6, Jesus said, when you fast, not if, when you fast, Jesus assumed His followers would fast. And frankly, I don't think we do it enough today. When you fast, don't draw attention to yourself as the Pharisees are in the habit of doing. Fasting is between a Christ follower and the Heavenly Father. And then to show us further what He's talking about, He asks a question in verse 21. Who would use new cloth to patch an old garment? The old garment is already shrunk. So if we use a new cloth on it, the new cloth will tear when it shrinks. In verse 22, he asks, who would put new wine that's still fermenting, still emitting gases? Who would put new wine in old wineskins that are already cracked and brittle? Christianity was not an extension of Judaism. It was the fulfillment of Judaism. The good news of Jesus Christ cannot be housed in the religion of the Pharisees. And if you're here this morning and you think Christianity is a list of things that we can do and a list of things that we can't do in order to relate to God, you need to discover that Christianity is a love relationship with God. If you're here this morning and you think Christianity is a list of rules that we need to keep, then take some time to study the depth and the magnitude of God's grace. Jesus was bringing a whole new way of life that was based more on love than it was on law, that was more concerned with pleasing God than it was obeying God, that emphasized relationship more than it did religion. You ever notice how one generation does business different than the previous generation and so on? I mean, how we did business 20 years ago is totally different from how we do business today. A few years ago, a salesman would make contact with the phone or make a personal visit, fly someplace. Today, you can Skype it, go to a meeting. There's a lot of ways that you can make a personal contact today. Financial information, you used to write it out on a ledger book. Today, it's all done on computers. My goodness, transactions can be made on a smartphone. It's right there. Totally different. Over the centuries, the message of God's immeasurable love has remained constant. And you know what? It's fresh to every generation. I mean, each generation, when they see that for the first time, it's like, wow, it's so cool. Well, it was cool in the generation before, and it will be cool in the generation that follows. But the methods that God's people use in communicating that message have to continually change. Now, when I first was in the ministry some 30 plus years ago, I used to write out my sermons by manuscript. Don't ask me why. Man, I grew up knowing, in 8th grade, I learned how to use a typewriter. We did have typewriters when I was younger, okay? I knew how to use it. I don't know why I wrote it out, but I did, and every time I'd reread it and make scribbles here and there. Man, by the time I got done, it looked like Egyptian hieroglyphics. You know what I'm saying? It took the Holy Spirit to figure out what that whole thing meant, what it said. And I had volumes of books and commentaries on my bookshelf, and I'd go to the library, try and find a cubby hole someplace where nobody could see me, where I could hide and be alone. But the internet and computers, they've changed all of the way of where I study and how I write my sermon. Cutting and pasting has replaced scribbling. A hard drive has replaced a filing cabinet for storing sermons. 30 plus years ago, churches often held 2-week revivals. Any of you remember those? 3 of us, thank you. 2-week revivals. Today you have a hard time getting people to attend a 2-hour seminar. I remember when weekly news bulletins and newsletters were printed by mimeograph machines. They've been replaced with Facebook and text and Twitter for getting out information today. Pianos and organs have been replaced with keyboards and guitars and drums and lights. Greek and Latin were eventually replaced by the King James Version of English in 1647, which has since been replaced by the New International Version and the New Living Translation and many modern versions and translations. And yet many stubbornly believe we shouldn't use any other version today except for the King James Version of the Bible, even though we have a generation of young people who have no idea what thee and thou means or how to put th on the end of every verb. Jesus wasn't saying his followers shouldn't fast. He was simply saying there's a time and there's a proper motive for fasting, and now isn't the right time. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the old wineskins that were used to deliver the fresh gospel, the fresh wine, the new wine to each generation. Nothing wrong with those methods. They worked. Jesus is simply saying that we will better reach our culture with the fresh, new gospel if we wrap it in culturally relevant ways. Because if we don't, this generation will view the good news as irrelevant and unnecessary, and honestly, many already do. And it's not because the gospel itself is irrelevant and unnecessary. It's because we have failed to communicate it in a way they can understand it. And so the question the church has to constantly be asking itself is this: how do we communicate the never-changing gospel to dying people living in an always-changing culture? And that was the issue that Jesus addressed in Levi's house nearly 2,000 years ago. It wasn't just about fasting. Jesus was saying, your ideas of religion, the traditions that you think are religious, they aren't working. They aren't penetrating the people who need to hear this good news. Jesus said you need to rethink what you believe. You need to rethink how you live what you believe, and you need to rethink how you share what you believe. If it's true then, it's still true today. Following her shoulder surgery in early December, Jane had been walking at the mall to get back in shape, and she was telling me about one occasion when there were 4 teenagers at the entrance of the mall. They didn't look like they were doing anything. And sometimes you know how we are. We look at people and, maybe they shouldn't be there at the entrance. Or our method of evangelism might be, you know what? If we can get them, I should just go and invite them to Wednesday night youth group because Devin will set them straight. Devin will share the light with those people. He'll help them change. And we laugh, but that's kind of the way we look at adult evangelism. Let's just get them to worship. Let's just bring them to church. And if we can get them there, they'll hear the message and their lives will be changed. Well, in case you hadn't noticed, they're here. They're coming. They may not look like us, but they worship with us. And if you will remember, some of the faces and some of the names of the people who were baptized and transferred last year, they came from the House of Compassion, and they came from the Van Orman House, and they came from the Halfway House. And the question we got to ask ourselves is, am I getting out of my personal comfort zone in order to go and talk and encourage people who are trying to find their way in life? Who feel like they need help and feel like this is the place to find help? Or do we just come Sunday after Sunday and talk to the people that we already feel comfortable with, who are already saved? Or worse yet, do we come and we sit and then we leave and not talk to anybody? That's right, I was telling a story. So Jane decided to take these 4 Down to Heavenly Breads. I don't know if you've been in the mall, but Down to Heavenly Breads. Bought them something, sat down, they started to talk. She knew a couple of them from school. Asked them how school was going. Eventually asked them about their families. Transitioned into talking about leadership. Transitioned into talking about eternity, life after death. And one of the kids says, man, that got serious pretty quick, didn't it? And she's telling me this, I'm thinking, so it should be done. She's convicting me here. Man, isn't it time that we quit expecting the world to come through our doors so that we can share the gospel with them and instead start taking Jesus to the world? Isn't it time the church concern ourselves more with how I can get out of my comfort zone so I can reach the lost than I am with remaining comfortable with those who are already saved? You know what motivates me? It's knowing this. Jesus Christ knows everything I think. He knows everything I say. He knows everywhere I go. He knows every website I ever visit. He knows what my real motives are, even when I try and fool others. He knows everything about me and everything about you, and yet He still loves me unconditionally. I don't get that. I don't understand that. I can't comprehend that. But what it does is motivates me and compels me that if He can love me like that, then I don't have any choice but to be an instrument through whom Jesus can love others like that. I don't have a choice but to take that good news to others. And the question all of us have got to ask ourselves this morning is this: am I doing that? Have I got my eyes open? Whether it's people in church or people outside of church, have I got my eyes open? Am I in tune to those who need to know Jesus?